The inspiration for Atlantis, the Minoans. The Atlantis Myth. The Atlantis myth has been around now for a long time and has featured in or inspired a great many different books, films, poems, and paintings over the years, from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Arthur Conan Doyle's The Maracot Deep to the poetry of Bertolt Brecht and even an episode of MacGyver. The use of it as an archetype of a utopian society to explore the problems of the contemporary world was echoed in Thomas More's Utopia and Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. The origins of the myth, though, can be traced to one writer and two of his writings. The author was Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher of the 4th century BCE and disciple of Socrates. Nearly all of Plato's writings were produced as dialogues, conversations between two or more individuals in which philosophical and political ideas were explored. The story of Atlantis was first described in two of these dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. Plato presented an image of a near-perfect society, found under the sea but functioning as though above water, with a perfectly planned city and society. Yet it was one which eventually fell foul of the gods and was destroyed, wiped away under the sea. Ever since, scholars have wondered what might have inspired the Atlantis myth. For instance, Plato had been writing around the time that Helike, a city on the Corinthian Gulf, had been swept away by a great tsunami in 373 BCE. But Helike was hardly a great or utopian society. Instead, many analysts have tended to think that Plato was actually basing his story about Atlantis on the Minoan civilization that flourished on the island of Crete in the first half of the 2nd millennium BCE. The Minoans had one of the most advanced cultures of the Bronze Age and influenced other societies all around the Eastern Mediterranean. However, on at least two different occasions, their society had been badly damaged by huge earthquakes and volcanic eruptions in the Aegean Sea. For this reason, while Plato clearly did not have one specific society in mind when he invented the myth of Atlantis, he was most likely to have been influenced by the Minoans when he concocted his elaborate tale to warn his readers about the folly of becoming overconfident about the alleged perfection of one society. So who were the Minoans? The emergence of the Minoans. First things first. The Minoans never would have referred to themselves as Minoans. This is a term which was invented by an archaeologist, Sir Arthur Evans, in the early 20th century in reference to the fact that in Greek mythology, King Minos was the ruler of the island of Crete. To this day, it remains unclear as to what the Minoans referred to themselves as. The Egyptians referred to them as Keftiu, the actual meaning of which is also unclear. Although they shared some cultural similarities with the Mycenaeans of the Greek mainland in the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, they were not Greeks and should not be considered as such, despite occupying an island which is considered an intrinsic part of Greece today. One reason for clearly distinguishing them from mainland Greek culture is that Minoan society had been evolving on Crete in its own unique way from around 3500 BCE. First, the Neolithic people here began to produce advanced types of pottery from 3100 BCE onwards. Then large towns emerged in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, and people here began trading widely around the Eastern Mediterranean. This led to contact with the more developed cultures of the Near East and Egypt, which in turn led to the introduction of new technologies and ideas into Crete. Finally, this culminated from around 1950 BCE onwards in a marked advancement of Cretan society. While many historians and archaeologists will characterize the people of the 3rd millennium BCE on Crete as early Minoans or Proto-Minoans, when we start talking about Minoan civilization and the period in which it flourished, we are effectively discussing the era from around 1950 BCE onwards down to around 1450 BCE, when their culture suffered a major collapse. This 500-year period is often divided into the proto-palatial and neo-palatial periods in reference to the fact that the main centers of settlement here were places like Knossos and Phaistos, where great palace complexes were built by the Minoans. Minoan writing systems. The society which emerged on Crete in the early 2nd millennium BCE is still not fully understood today, something which is partly owing to the mysterious hieroglyphic writing systems which the Minoans used. Archaeologists have identified at least 4 different writing systems used at Knossos and other locations on Crete. These are named Linear A, Linear B, Cypro-Minoan, and Cretan hieroglyphic. What is unusual about these is that they are not all clearly related to each other. For decades after Arthur Evans undertook his pioneering archaeological work on the island, between the 1900s and early 1930s, these systems were virtually impenetrable. However, Linear B was deciphered in the 1950s, and it was demonstrated that it had been influenced by the writing systems of mainland Greece. The other 3 systems, Linear A, Cypro-Minoan, and Cretan hieroglyphic, remain undeciphered to this day. They clearly employed elements of writing systems which were completely different from what was being utilized in Greece. What this means is that scholars of the Minoans have had a large corpus of inscriptions, stone and clay tablets, and other written evidence from Crete in the 2nd millennium BCE that they have been looking at for over a century without ever figuring out how to fully read it. Scholars are confident that they know the meaning of some of the hieroglyphs and symbols, though others remain a mystery, and with them much that we might otherwise know about the Minoans. Minoan Palace Society. Given these limitations around the Minoan writing systems, it is easy to understand why we still do not have a full understanding of how Minoan government and society actually functioned. Arthur Evans and a generation of archaeologists who followed him thought that the Minoans were ruled over by a small cohort of monarchs and aristocrats who lived in vast palaces in Knossos, the largest of the Minoan cities, and other sites like Phaistos, Malaya, and Zakros. This theory has since been discredited. It now appears that what were formerly interpreted as being enormous royal palaces were in fact sprawling civic centers, complexes that combined temples, administrative centers, and residences for the priestly classes and bureaucrats. It is possible that there were no kings at all, and that the individual Minoan cities were actually administered by a body of priests and priestesses who presided over a reasonably egalitarian system, one that managed trade and the distribution of goods from the palaces. A number of studies have even suggested that the priestesses were in charge, effectively making Minoan Crete a unique society within the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean and Near East in being a matriarchy. We cannot be sure, and much may be revealed if Linear A is ever fully deciphered. But what seems clear is that Minoan society was unusually structured. Evans believed that the people who lived here worshipped a single fertility goddess based on the profusion of snake goddess statuettes or figurines which were found around the remains of Knossos. It seems clear now that the Minoans worshipped multiple deities, but this fertility goddess must have been somewhat preeminent. While slavery was clearly practiced in the palace society of the Minoans, it appears to have been on a much more limited scale than was the case in other parts of the Bronze Age world. The Palace of Knossos. We can get a better sense of how this palace society functioned by examining the remains of the Palace of Knossos, the largest of the palace centers of the Minoans. It is found on the outskirts of the city of Heraklion today. The palace was enormous, covering some 22,000 square meters and being comprised of approximately 1,300 different rooms. At its heart was a rectangular court which served as a species of town square and was used for festivals and rituals. Around this were other civic buildings like a theater and religious buildings, though the function of many of them is not clear. 4 different wings spread out from this central space, and within these were clearly apartments for people who lived within the palace and storerooms of one kind or another. There were complex water management systems in place for capturing and storing rainwater, while water was also piped to Knossos from natural springs at Archenes about 10 kilometers away. Perhaps the most cryptic room of all was the throne room. This was built in the 15th century BCE and featured a central seat with some benches around it. The room had frescoes decorating the walls around it. It is easy to see why it was interpreted as a throne room, but historians are much more inclined to think now that this was a room for religious ceremonies of some kind, possibly where a high priestess held court or carried out some sort of ritual. Minoan Art. The Palace of Knossos and the other major palaces at Phaistos, Malaya, and Zakros were decorated extensively with frescoes. Minoan art is notable for its lifelike images and realism by comparison with other contemporary societies such as New Kingdom Egypt or the various cultures of Mesopotamia during the Bronze Age. 2 excellent examples are the dolphin fresco and the ship procession fresco. The dolphin fresco depicts a maritime scene with various marine life swimming around, and in which dolphins are dominant. It is found on the wall of a chamber in the residential apartments in the east wing of the Palace of Knossos. The ship procession fresco is actually found on the island of Thera, north of Crete, an island which is understood to have been absorbed into the Minoan sphere of influence and which had extensive Minoan art, which has survived at Akrotiri in pristine condition. It shows a Minoan ship sailing along in a very detailed scene that depicts people within a port and various other activities. One final unusual feature of Minoan art is that it tends to be gender delineated, meaning that men and women are almost never featured together on paintings, pottery, or statuary. They are kept separate, something which may reflect the social values of what it is increasingly clear was a highly matriarchal society. Minoan Trade. The Minoans were clearly a substantial trading power in the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Minoan pottery was particularly prized in the period between 1800 BCE and 1600 BCE, and fragments of it have been found in Cyprus, Greece, Anatolia, Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. While it has been theorized that the influence of Minoan artistry influenced pottery production as far away as the oasis of Critias in northern Arabia. Crete's geography and climate are ideal for the production of olives and grapes, and so olive oil and wine were also major exports. The trade in the other direction was very varied. It is unsurprising to find that the Minoans had substantial interactions with the people of Cyprus, not just based on their geographical proximity and their both being islands in the eastern Mediterranean, but also because Cyprus was the biggest producer of copper in the known Mediterranean world throughout antiquity, the key metal needed to make bronze, on which so much of Minoan culture depended. The trade with the Levant would have fed into a trade network which ultimately ran to northwestern Arabia, and from there south towards what is now Yemen, bringing spices and incense from that part of the world all the way to places like Crete. This was all part of the Bronze Age boom in trade and the simultaneous societal development which occurred across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East between 1800 BCE and 1300 BCE, a period of unprecedented prosperity and cultural progress for multiple societies like Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and New Kingdom Egypt that were all in close proximity to one another and benefited from trade and cultural interactions. Theseus and the Minotaur. Minoan Crete would subsequently become closely associated with a famous story of Greek mythology, one which emphasizes that while the Minoans were not Greeks, their culture began to overlap with that of the Greeks in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. This concerned Theseus, a legendary hero of the city of Athens, who by some accounts was a son of Poseidon, the god of the seas. King Minos of Crete had previously been at war with Athens, and this had resulted in a peace agreement whereby Athens had to send 14 youths to Crete every 9 years to be effectively fed to a monstrous half-bull, half-man creature that lived in the labyrinths under the Palace of Knossos, which the hero Daedalus had built. This Minotaur had stalked the labyrinth for generations and was a monstrous creature that the Minoans were forced to appease by sacrifices. Theseus headed for Crete to slay the beast and end the sacrifice of the Athenian youths. Once on Crete, Theseus won the affections of Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, who supplied him with a ball of string which he could use to trace his path through the labyrinth and find his way out again once he had defeated the Minotaur. Armed therewith, Theseus descended into the labyrinth. The ensuing clash between him and the beast was one of the most famous stories of ancient Greek mythology, one which various versions of were produced by poets, playwrights, and even an alleged biography of Theseus. The most common has Theseus confronting the beast in the center of the labyrinth and stabbing it to death through the eye. More broadly, the story is indicative of the way in which Minoan culture was being absorbed into that of the wider Greeks in ancient times. It also points towards the manner in which a practice known as bull leaping and the use of bull horns as symbols were incorporated into Minoan religious life. We find this bullhorn symbolism appearing frequently in Minoan art and architecture. The Encroachment of Mycenae. That the Greeks began to view the Minoans as part of their collective ancient past, and that Linear B was influenced by Mycenaean Greek, is not surprising. While the Minoans were a distinct culture, their island was gradually pulled into the Mycenaean sphere of influence in the 15th and 14th centuries BCE. Mycenae rose as a major center of power in the Peloponnese region of mainland Greece from 1600 BCE onwards. It eventually became the leading city of the region, one with a population of tens of thousands of people and at the head of a powerful network of allied cities and towns. It was from this era that the tales of the Trojan War date, with Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, being the political leader of the Greeks who launched the war in order to retrieve Helen, the wife of his brother Menelaus, king of Sparta, after she was abducted by the Prince of Troy, Paris. We will never be able to tell for certain if the legendary tales of the Trojan War were based on an actual war which took place in Bronze Age times, or if they were completely invented. But we do know that the Mycenaeans were encroaching around 1450 BCE onto Crete, and that eventually they played a role in the downfall of Minoan society. They were helped to a great extent, though, by a series of natural disasters. Disasters and decline. It is widely appreciated that while the Mycenaeans possibly brought Minoan civilization to an end, it had already been badly weakened by several natural disasters. Around 1600 BCE, a violent volcanic eruption devastated the island of Thera, also known as Santorini, which, as we have seen, was a sphere of influence of the Minoans. It destroyed much of the Minoan palace there at Akrotiri, while the associated earthquake and tsunami spread outwards and hit neighboring islands, notably Crete and the Palace of Knossos, which lies on the northern coast there and was completely exposed to the tsunami. This was clearly a vicious volcanic eruption and earthquake, one which has been compared with the explosion of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815, an event so destructive that 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Such was the scale of the volcanic winter which followed the eruption. Clearly, Minoan society was badly destabilized by it, though in this particular instance when they rebuilt, they did so stronger and better. What happened thereafter is something of a mystery. Minoan civilization flourished again down to 1450 BCE, but thereafter it began to decline owing to possible further natural disasters. A plague epidemic which was sweeping the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, and possibly a breakdown in the social order in Minoan society, perhaps brought about by harvest failures. All of these things coalesced to weaken the Minoans just as the Mycenaeans were attempting to expand throughout the Aegean, and between 1450 BCE and 1400 BCE, the Greeks clearly gained influence over parts of the island. Thereafter, Minoan society went into terminal decline, and by 1100 BCE it was all but extinct, with the great palaces abandoned and its trade connections collapsing as part of the wider Late Bronze Age collapse. Such was the extent of the subsequent Mycenaean takeover that for many centuries it was assumed that the remains of the palaces and other buildings at Knossos and elsewhere on the island were effectively part of the wider Greek Bronze Age culture. It was only when Arthur Evans began his pioneering archaeological work here from 1900 onwards that it became apparent that a completely different culture had existed here shortly before the Mycenaean intervention, a culture which, as the continuing issues of deciphering Linear A and the other Minoan hieroglyphic scripts demonstrates, has yet to fully reveal all its secrets. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to show your support, and watch more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. We'll see you in the next one.